When Twister tore into theaters in the summer of 1996, most moviegoers showed up expecting a wild thrill ride, full of roaring tornadoes, collapsing barns, airborne livestock, and dramatic weather chases. And the film delivered exactly that, with a side of early CGI chaos, a thumping musical score, and a surprisingly emotional story of estranged storm-chasing scientists. But amidst the mayhem and meteorology, something unexpected emerged from the debris to steal the spotlight. A fire engine red Dodge Ram 2500. Not just a background vehicle or a utilitarian mode of transport for the heroes, this pickup became a full-blown character, a screen-grabbing symbol of power, resilience, and swagger that matched the fury of the storms it chased. This wasn't just a truck with a few lines of dialogue or a brief cameo. It was a 5,800-pound, steel-bodied force of nature, powered by an 8-liter Magnum V10 engine, and built to take a beating. While Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt's characters darted from one monster twister to the next, it was the Ram that did the heavy lifting, smashing through fences, powering across flooded fields, getting crushed by debris, and still soldiering on. In one of the movie's most iconic moments, it even drove straight through a house and kept going without stalling. It was the vehicle that carried the experimental Dorothy tornado sensors into the heart of danger, and the only machine rugged enough to get the job done. Chrysler didn't just slip their product into a few scenes for exposure, they embedded it into the very fabric of the story, turning the Ram into a symbol of capability and unflinching grit. If Twister was a 2-hour Dodge commercial, it was the best one ever made, and no one left the theater complaining. By the mid-1990s, the American pickup truck was having an identity crisis in the best possible way. For decades, it had been a tool first and a vehicle second, a rolling lunchbox with a bed, a column shifter, and the social grace of a hammer. It hauled hay, gravel, plywood, and occasionally someone's pride. It lived in the world of work boots and split knuckles, of early mornings and late paychecks, of tailgates used as benches, desks, and sometimes impromptu confessionals. Nobody bought one to be admired. They bought one because it could take a beating, keep moving, and come back for more. And then, seemingly overnight, it started showing up washed, waxed, and parked diagonally at the mall like it had just discovered hair gel. The same vehicle class that once smelled faintly of sawdust and gasoline began to smell, at least metaphorically, like new leather and confidence. You could almost feel the cultural shift in the way people talked about them. A pickup wasn't just something you drove. It was something you chose, on purpose, with a certain look in mind. That change didn't happen in a vacuum. The country was already being quietly retrained to want big, tall vehicles for everyday life. Full-size SUVs were becoming the default answer for families who wanted space without the stigma of a minivan. And once an SUV started offering nicer seats, quieter cabins, and creature comforts that would have seemed laughably precious in earlier decades, it became harder to explain why a pickup, often built from the same basic bones, should remain a Spartan penalty box. At the same time, suburban life was expanding, weekend projects were multiplying, and the idea of utility was being redefined. Utility no longer meant I haul feed. It meant I might buy a couch, or I tow a boat twice a summer, or I like knowing I could do those things if I wanted to. The pickup truck was beginning to drift from pure function toward possibility. And possibility is where status symbols like to live. Into this moment rumbled Dodge's loudest, squarest, most swaggering statement, the second-generation Ram. It arrived for the 1994 model year with a big rig face, tall grille, proud stance, fenders that looked like they'd been doing curls. And it didn't just join the pickup market. It kicked open the doors, adjusted its collar, and asked who had been running the place. Where other trucks of the era often played it safe with flatter noses and polite, workmanlike proportions, the Ram leaned into drama. It looked like a semi-truck had been shrunk in the dryer and then sent back out with something to prove. That was the point. Dodge wasn't merely refreshing sheet metal. It was changing the emotional tone of the segment. The message was visible at 50 yards. This wasn't a farm implement that happened to have a radio. This was a pickup that wanted you to feel something when you saw it. Chrysler debuted the redesigned truck at the 1993 North American International Auto Show, put it on sale later in 1993, and watched it become a sales and image turnaround strong enough to win Motor Trend's 1994 Truck of the Year. That award mattered not just because it was a trophy, but because it signaled legitimacy. The Ram range already had history, of course, though much of it was the sort of history that loyalists recited with the protective tenderness normally reserved for underdogs and old dogs. Dodge truck people could sound like genealogists, remembering which years were good, which years were weird, and which years were only good if one happened to own exactly the right spec with exactly the right engine and exactly the right story attached to it. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Dodge pickups weren't the default choice in the way Ford's F-Series had become, and Dodge knew it. Ford had the cultural momentum, GM had the familiarity, and Dodge often felt like the brand you defended rather than the one you casually recommended. When a product lives in that position, it can't afford to whisper. It has to announce itself. So the redesign wasn't a gentle refresh. It was a hard pivot into theatrical presence, the kind of reinvention that doesn't ask permission. The goal wasn't merely to modernize sheet metal or tweak the grille. The goal was to make a truck that looked like it belonged on a billboard, even when it was sitting in a muddy driveway. Even the internal logic sounded like a movie pitch. Make it look like the trucks people watch thunder by on the interstate, the ones hauling impossible loads behind a wall of chrome and confidence. An overview of the development notes how the big rig style front end and large grille were considered risky at first, then proved popular. Translation: Dodge gambled that truck buyers wanted to be seen and that they wanted their truck to look like it could tow the moon, even if it mostly towed a weekend project and a cooler. It wasn't subtle, and it didn't intend to be. The face was a statement, the stance was a stance, and the whole truck had the posture of something that expected traffic to move out of its way. That desire to be seen was quietly building across the whole market too, which is what made Dodge's gamble feel less like a coin flip and more like catching the wind at the right moment. Pickups had always had personal use buyers, but by the mid-1990s, the personal use buyer was becoming the center of gravity. More people were buying trucks because they liked trucks, not strictly because their work required one. Meanwhile, full-size SUVs were expanding from niche utility into mainstream family hauling, and as SUV interiors became nicer, it became harder to justify why the pickup sitting on the same basic bones should feel like a barn with seat belts. If the SUV could offer plush seating, better sound insulation, and amenities that made long drives feel less like penance, then the pickup, often sharing platforms, powertrains, and showroom floors, started to look overdue for the same treatment. Trim levels and comfort packages began creeping upward, and manufacturers learned that buyers were happy to pay for convenience and polish as long as the vehicle still looked and sounded tough. Ford, for instance, offered an Eddie Bauer trim on the F-150 during this era, a name borrowed from the outdoorsy luxury world that suggested the truck was not just capable, but curated. It implied that this was a vehicle for someone who might genuinely camp, but might also, just like the idea of camping so much, they wanted it stitched into their seat backs. The messaging was subtle, but important. A pickup could be rugged and comfortable, hardworking and presentable, tool and trophy at the same time. Dodge's second-gen Ram stepped into that shifting landscape like it had already memorized its camera angles. It was still absolutely a work truck, in the sense that it could actually do the work, not merely cosplay as capable. It came in the expected ladder of half-ton 1500, three-quarter-ton 2500, and one-ton 3500. And that ladder mattered because it told buyers Dodge wasn't just building a fashion statement. It was building a full lineup with real purpose at each rung. Under the hood, it offered engines ranging from sensible V6 and V8 options up through the kind of torque-forward bravado that sounded like it was designed by someone who thought subtlety was a rumor. The heavy-duty models could be had with a Cummins turbo diesel, a badge that already carried its own legend among people who spoke fluent towing capacity. But Dodge also offered an 8-liter Magnum V10, a gasoline answer to the eternal question, what if a truck didn't just pull, but pulled with theatrical flair? It delivered big toe energy for people who wanted muscle without diesel clatter, and it gave the lineup a headline option that sounded like it belonged in a drag strip parking lot, even if it spent its life on highways and job sites. Motor Trend's later retrospective calls the V10 a thermonuclear option, and the numbers were dramatic for the time, the kind that made brochures feel like power fantasies and made competitors pay attention. All of that matters because of what happened next. Hollywood found the Ram's face irresistible. When Twister hit theaters in 1996, it wasn't just a disaster movie. It was a 2-hour tribute to bad weather, brave science, and the concept of driving directly toward problems with the kind of confidence that suggests a complete lack of interest in self-preservation. It was wind, rain, grit, screaming tires, and the peculiar American belief that the correct response to a mile-wide tornado is to take notes while getting closer. And if one chooses to write history with a wink, it becomes clear that the film's true hero was not a person at all. Not even the fearless experts with their color-coded maps and half-finished sandwiches. It was a bright red Dodge Ram, typically identified as a 2500 in the movie's storm-chasing role, that spent the runtime doing what all great cinematic heroes do, showing up at the worst possible moments, keeping its composure when the world turns sideways, and refusing to quit even when the laws of physics begin to file formal complaints. It is the sort of hero that never delivers a speech, never stares meaningfully into the distance, and never asks for credit. It just starts, moves, endures, and in the process becomes the reliable center of gravity in a story where everything else is trying to fly. Chrysler entered into an official partnership with the production, ensuring the Ram didn't just appear, but performed. This was not the kind of movie vehicle that idles politely in the background while the human beings do the important work of shouting and pointing at the horizon. This was a deliberate, planned-on-paper decision to make the truck part of the storytelling apparatus, the way a prop becomes a character when the camera keeps returning to it and the plot repeatedly depends on it. The Ram was framed, lit, and used like a co-star. It arrived with purpose. It was given heroic tasks. It was placed in scenes where failure would have meant catastrophe. And it was allowed to take a beating that would have sent most vehicles limping off-screen to die quietly. The film treated it as transportation with a destiny, granting it its own kind of arc. Introduction as the capable newcomer, escalation through repeated trials, and a grimly noble third act sacrifice that cemented its legend. It was, in other words, not so much a pickup truck as a very large, very red participant in the drama. On screen, the truck driven by Bill Harding is presented as a 1995 Dodge Ram 2500 Club Cab 4x4, finished in flame red and equipped, at least canonically, with the thunderous 8-liter Magnum V10. The color alone was a statement. In a movie filled with bruised skies, brown fields, gray roads, and the muted palettes of storm season, that red was a visual flair. It telegraphed confidence and readability, ensuring that even when the camera was shaking, the rain was slanting, and debris was doing its best impression of angry confetti, the audience could still find the hero vehicle in the chaos. Under the hood, the V10 choice was equally symbolic. That engine was real, recently introduced, and ridiculous in the best way, the kind of power plant that sounded like it had been designed by someone who took more as a personal philosophy. It produced 300 horsepower and 450 pounds-feet of torque at a time when those numbers didn't read like polite marketing copy, but like a warning label. In the mid-1990s, that kind of torque was what people bragged about in parking lots, what towing guys whispered about at gas stations, what made the idea of pulling a trailer up a grade feel less like labor and more like conquest. Dodge had created the first factory V10 pickup as an alternative to diesel, and Twister made sure audiences knew it without needing to turn the movie into a brochure. The camera lingered on the truck's profile, and badges proclaiming V10 appear on the truck's flanks. Occasionally in places Dodge engineers never intended, and sometimes with the subtle precision of a sticker, applied in a hurry by someone who had a tornado scene to shoot. Still, the message was clear. This was not a farm implement. This was not the sort of truck that existed to haul mulch twice a year and then spend the rest of its life growing old behind a shed. This was a force of nature with cup holders, a machine that looked like it belonged in the same conversation as the storms it pursued. In practice, several Rams were used during filming because even a Ram 2500 has limits, especially when asked to repeatedly flirt with simulated F3s and one very angry F5. A movie can demand heroics that real engineering never signed off on, and Twister demanded a lot. High-speed runs on imperfect roads, sudden stops, aggressive turns, impacts with props, brutal suspension travel, and the kind of repeated stress that turns brand new into please stop asking it to do that in a hurry. Some trucks were true heavy-duty 2500s with 8-lug axles and towering suspension, wearing their weight class the way a heavyweight boxer wears broad shoulders. Others were 1500s dressed up for stunt work, rebadged, lifted, or cosmetically modified so the average moviegoer wouldn't start counting lug nuts and writing angry letters to the editor. Movie continuity is a fragile truce between what's ideal and what's available, and trucks in action films are not treated gently enough to keep them identical for long. A door might get replaced, a bed might get swapped, a tailgate might be sacrificed to the gods of scheduling, and suddenly the hero truck is the same, but also, mysteriously, not the same. Sound effects added another layer of practical storytelling. Engine audio often came from the familiar 5.9-liter V8, because the V10, while mighty, sounded different enough to confuse the emotional narrative of truck noises mean safety. The V8's note was recognizable, comfortable, and cinematic. The audio equivalent of a firm handshake. So the movie sometimes let the Ram look like a V10 while sounding like the V8 that audiences unconsciously expected a tough truck to sound like. Continuity wandered in other small, strangely charming ways. Tailgates healed themselves between scenes. Dents vanished like bad dreams. Certain accessories appeared and disappeared as if the truck were quietly shedding weight to improve its chances of outrunning the weather. At least one Ram seemed to possess regenerative bodywork, suggesting Chrysler briefly experimented with supernatural metallurgy, or more realistically, that the film crew simply had multiple, nearly identical trucks, and the plot did not pause to explain which one had which bruise. The result is that the Ram doesn't merely appear in Twister, it performs a public service announcement on behalf of pickup trucks, quietly rewriting what a truck is allowed to mean in the middle of a popcorn blockbuster. It isn't there as background scenery or a disposable prop that exists only to be dented, flipped, and forgotten. It carries the protagonists into danger with the steady confidence of a loyal sidekick, the kind that never asks for credit and never stops showing up, even when the sky has turned the color of a bruise. It gets dirty without looking defeated, because the dirt reads less like damage and more like proof of character. It takes the hits, keeps its composure, and somehow manages to look tougher the worse the weather gets, which is basically the cinematic definition of heroism. It frames the characters as serious, capable people, because when someone climbs out of a truck that looks like it could tow a small courthouse, the audience tends to believe they can also assemble a tornado sensor named Dorothy on the fly, argue about meteorological theory at top volume, and then sprint back into the cab before a fence post becomes airborne. Even the truck's presence does narrative work. It signals that these aren't tourists in Tornado Alley. They're professionals, or at least professionals in the particular American discipline of driving directly at something that is actively trying to kill you. What makes the Ram's performance especially effective is that it doesn't need dialogue. It communicates through stance, sound, and the way it occupies a frame. The high hood and broad grille aren't just styling. On screen, they become posture. The big tires and tall ride height become a visual promise that the next patch of mud won't be the end of the story. When it roars forward, the film treats that motion like momentum with purpose, as if the Ram itself understands the assignment. By the time the movie has put it through enough near misses to qualify for its own insurance category, the audience has started to trust it the way they trust a good movie dog. It will suffer, it will struggle, but it will not abandon its people. Real Truck's retrospective on the film's famous trucks leans right into that feeling, describing the Ram as bold, reliable, and repeatedly saving the protagonist before ultimately sacrificing itself for the mission. Language normally reserved for action heroes and golden retrievers. That last part matters, because sacrifice is what separates a cool vehicle from a legendary one. Plenty of cars and trucks have looked good on film, but fewer have been made to feel like they chose to be there, as if they were emotionally invested in science, survival, and the noble cause of not being turned into airborne scrap. In Twister, the Ram becomes the moving center of gravity, a piece of mechanical certainty and a plot that is otherwise built out of uncertainty, wind shear, and the constant possibility of a cow entering the conversation at high speed. Dodge didn't need Twister to start the Ram's turnaround because the redesign already did a lot of heavy lifting. The truck arrived at the right moment with a look that didn't resemble the polite, flat-faced pickups people were used to seeing, and the market responded immediately. Sales jumped dramatically after the new model arrived. One commonly cited set of figures shows Ram sales climbing from about 95,000 units in 1993 to over 232,000 in 1994 and around 410,000 in 1995, holding above 400,000 into the late 1990s. Those numbers tell the story of a product that suddenly captured attention and held it. But the movie did something numbers can't fully capture. It attached emotion to the sheet metal. It gave the truck a narrative, and narratives travel farther than spec sheets. Motor Trend's look back at the era frames the second-generation truck as a shockwave that forced the rest of Detroit to chase the same brawnier, more theatrical look, and it specifically calls out Twister as part of Dodge's push to get the new Ram in front of the public. That framing is important because it suggests a 1-2 punch. The design created the opening, and pop culture helped widen it. In other words, the truck was already selling, but the film helped turn it into a symbol. It's one thing for a pickup to be a success. It's another for it to be recognizable to people who don't know a torque rating from a taco. Twister made the Ram legible as a concept even to viewers who had never shopped for a truck and never planned to. It made the vehicle feel like an obvious answer to a question the audience hadn't consciously asked yet. What would you want beneath you when the world starts coming apart? After all, if a truck can stare down a tornado with the grim determination of a movie star, surely it can stare down a Tuesday. Was the Ram the first modern pickup question gets asked in a lot of parking lots and internet threads, usually between someone leaning on a tailgate and someone else swearing their uncle had the real first one. And the honest answer is that first is always messier than the legend people want to tell. Pickups didn't wake up one morning and decide to become glamorous. Luxury touches had been sneaking into trucks for years in little incremental ways. Nicer cloth, plusher seat padding, power windows appearing where you used to get a hand crank and a sigh, cassette decks, and then better stereos, paint colors that looked less like farm equipment and more like something you'd pick on purpose. That's where the second-generation Ram becomes a strong candidate for a real inflection point. Not necessarily the first pickup to be comfortable, not necessarily the first to offer nicer trims, and definitely not the first to be purchased by someone who enjoyed the idea of a truck as much as the utility of it. What it did, unmistakably, was make mainstream pickups unapologetically styled. It wasn't simply refreshed or updated in a polite, evolutionary way. It was designed to look powerful and desirable in a way that read instantly from across the street, across a parking lot, or, more importantly, across a movie screen where subtlety goes to die. The Ram's face wasn't trying to blend in with sedans. It wasn't even trying to blend in with other trucks. It looked like it belonged to a different species, something closer to a highway tractor than a humble half-ton, and it carried itself accordingly. It made the act of driving a pickup feel like a visible decision, the kind you could recognize before you even noticed what wheels were under it. And Twister helped lock that look and the attitude behind it into the public imagination. It did so not by lecturing anyone about lifestyle, not by pausing the plot so a character could explain why a pickup is a smart choice, and not by winking at the audience with an obvious commercial. Instead, it told a story where the pickup was essential to heroism, and it kept returning to that visual logic again and again. When danger arrived, the truck was already there, engine running, ready to take the hit. A vehicle that can take a pounding from hail, mud, and chaos, and still charge toward a swirling black wall of doom feels, in the logic of cinema, like a vehicle that can also handle commuting, camping, towing, weekend projects, and an emotional support role on difficult Mondays. Films don't just show products, they assign them personalities. When a vehicle becomes an object of narrative trust, when it consistently behaves like the reliable partner that never panics, it becomes an object of consumer desire. People may not consciously think, I want the truck that saves the protagonist, but they do absorb the feeling that this truck equals capability, confidence, and cool under pressure. The industry response over the following years made the pattern obvious to anyone paying attention in showrooms, on highways, or in the swelling number of glossy truck ads that started to feel like cologne commercials with tow ratings. Competitors didn't abandon work capability because a pickup still has to do pickup things. And the marketing department only gets away with so much fiction before the customer hooks up a trailer. But they leaned harder into bold design, improved ride comfort, and interiors that felt less like a break room bolted to a chassis, and more like a place you wouldn't mind spending hours. Trims and packages began to sound less like job classifications and more like club memberships, as if the buyer wasn't selecting a tool, but choosing an identity. Even within broader market coverage of the time, the language around new trucks increasingly highlighted comfort, quietness, and everyday livability, right alongside toughness. Because the manufacturers understood what buyers were doing, driving these trucks daily, using them as family vehicles, taking them to work and then out to dinner, asking them to be both utility and personal statement without forcing a second vehicle into the driveway. The pickup was becoming a dual-purpose machine, Workhorse on paper, personal flagship in practice. A vehicle that could still haul when needed, but also look like it belonged in front of a nice restaurant without needing to apologize. That's why the Ram in Twister gets to be remembered as a true hero, without anyone needing to file a correction. In a film full of humans making questionable decisions at high speed, some of them noble, some of them ridiculous, all of them loud, the Red Ram is the one presence that seems unwaveringly competent. It goes where it's pointed, even when where it's pointed is objectively a terrible idea. It holds the line through weather that looks designed by a special effects team with a grudge. It looks good doing it, which matters more than anyone likes to admit, because people don't fall in love with transportation strictly through spreadsheets. And then, like all great screen legends, it exits in a way that makes people talk about it for decades, often while shopping for a used one, browsing listings late at night, or spotting a surviving example on the road and feeling an almost embarrassing jolt of nostalgia. They don't make them like that anymore, becomes less a factual claim and more a kind of affectionate mythology, the highest compliment a pickup can receive, because it suggests the truck wasn't just built, it was made with a personality. If Twister didn't single-handedly invent the modern status symbol pickup, it certainly helped popularize the idea that a pickup could be a starring role in someone's life, not merely an accessory to their work. It encouraged the public to see trucks not only as equipment, but as characters. Brave, durable, dependable, and a little larger than life. Dodge brought the costume and the face. Hollywood supplied the myth. And the audience, America, keys in hand, decided the myth looked good in the driveway, looked even better reflected in storefront windows, and felt best of all when the driver's seat made ordinary errands seem just a little more heroic.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 1 9 on X, we're here just for you.